In development for upwards of 6 years, the creation of Halo Infinite is nearly as fascinating as the game itself. It's a game that started development before the release of Xbox One X and finishes 1 year after Xbox Series X and S first launched. It's built on a new engine, the Slipspace engine, and it marks the series' move to a new style of single-player progression by embracing open-world design. The multiplayer is already a hit and publicly available, but the campaign has remained shrouded in mystery. This is where the ambitions become most evident. To say this was a significant undertaking for primary developer 343 Industries would be an understatement, I think. And now, at last, we've experienced this campaign for ourselves. The many questions we've had during development have answers, and the technology, well, the strengths and weaknesses are laid bare here. So today, with the release of Halo Infinite, we're going to walk through various aspects of the campaign in its final form, discussing what works and what does not along the way. When I say walk through, I mean it. We'll begin right at the beginning of the game and work our way through the first few missions, discussing our findings as we uncover them. With that in mind, let's get into it. The rise of the open world is a topic I've discussed at length over the years, and needless to say, I was concerned that this would impact the quality of the Halo Infinite campaign. These concerns, however, are mostly unfounded. Halo Infinite's approach to level design works extremely well, just as the preview build suggested. This is not a retread of recent Far Cry games. This is a game which takes the foundational building blocks of Halo 1's second mission and basically expands it into a game far larger in scope. It works surprisingly well and retains much of what made Halo a special experience in the first place, while introducing a level of freedom that feels like a natural extension. As a result, Halo Infinite shares more with something like Crysis in terms of level design and pacing than recent Far Cry games, and that's a good thing, I think. But despite these constraints, the map in Halo Infinite is still far larger than any mission featured in prior Halo games, and this presents a unique technical challenge for the team, hence the need for a new engine. This new Slipspace engine allows for large draw distances and active AI miles into the expanse. But of course, this comes with some caveats which we'll discuss shortly. For this video, we'll be primarily focusing on the Xbox Series X version of Halo Infinite, the premier console version. We'll be covering the last generation versions of the game in a coming video for those curious. Now, when you first fire up Halo Infinite, you have a choice to make, quality or performance mode. But how do these actually stack up? Well, in quality mode, the Series X aims for a native 4K resolution, but does lean on dynamic resolution scaling, much like Halo 5. The good news is that it generally manages to stay above 80% scaling on the axes, retaining crisp pixel edges in the process. In comparison, the performance mode tops out at 1440p, but can dip under 1080p when things get hectic. In addition, the performance mode features a reduced level of detail for many distant objects, especially noticeable on foliage, in addition to a reduced quality SSR. Some of these details may be down to the lower resolution, however. Now, in terms of performance, Halo Infinite targets 60 frames per second in quality mode, while the performance mode impressively aims for 120 frames per second, a very aggressive target for a game of this scale. Note that this only applies to the Xbox Series X version, at least as far as consoles are concerned. And it's an impressive achievement because with 120 frames per second you have just 8 milliseconds to render each frame. Now here's the thing, Halo Infinite leans heavily on variable rate shading or VRS. This technique, to put it in very simple terms, effectively varies the amount of GPU power spent on different parts of the screen based on their complexity. The effectiveness of VRS can vary based on various factors, and in the case of Halo Infinite, it exhibits noticeable artifacts, especially when combined with temporal anti-aliasing. The result here is that it can wind up looking a little fuzzier in motion than you might expect given the pixel count. To offset this, however, I would suggest reducing the sharpness slider in the video menu to no more than 25%. I feel this helps produce a cleaner looking image while in motion. There are other interesting settings here as well, including the option to disable the speed lines while sprinting if you like. One thing to note about VRS though is that it looks pretty good when running in quality mode, but the performance mode exhibits many more visual artifacts as a result of the lower rendering resolution. Overall, I'd say image quality is acceptable in most situations. The actual pixel count is more than adequate overall, but the implementation of VRS and TAA demonstrates why raw pixel count is not always the most important metric. As far as actual frame rate performance is concerned, we'll discuss that later in the video, but this is overall the lay of the land on Xbox Series X as far as image quality goes. Once you've selected your preferred video mode then, it's time to jump into the game. Halo Infinite begins with a short CG introduction, before transitioning to a real-time cutscene. After a brief glimpse of the pilot in his younger days, we're pushed forward to the present where he discovers Master Chief. You'll encounter a lot of cutscenes throughout Halo's story, and the storytelling is pretty good, but unfortunately, the issue we mentioned in our preview remains, the cutscene stutter. Why is this important? Well, essentially, during the cutscenes, camera and character movement does not appear fluid to the eye. If we slow it down, you can see that certain frames persist on screen longer than others, leading to this juddery appearance. It's frustrating because this is not a performance issue. The Series X is having zero issues hitting 60 frames per second in these scenes. The problem lies elsewhere and is in fact even present on the PC. But there is some good news here. 343 actually got back to us regarding this and have noted that they've looked into the problem and managed to track down the issue. They're currently testing a patch and hope to issue something shortly after launch. There's no date given, of course, but if this works out, it's a good indication as to why such critiques are valuable in the first place. We'll keep an eye on this going forward. But still, at least the content of the cutscenes is beautiful. The rendering on Chief himself is especially excellent. Compared to the 2020 showing, his armor appears worn and scarred from the battles he's endured. The material quality on Chief's armor is suitably attractive, and the sequence featuring his exit from the Pelican into the first stage is beautifully designed. Once you take control though, the game makes a very strong first impression. The introduction stage is beautifully designed with excellent physically based metal materials and recognizably Halo-like ship design. Walk up close to any surface and you're greeted with a superb attention to detail, while atmospheric volumetric lighting fills many of its tunnels. This is also where you'll first encounter the Banished, which are basically enemies from Halo's past, and that's not a bad thing. From grunts to brutes and the elites, the new models are beautifully crafted, perfectly matching the classic Halo aesthetic, while simultaneously improving the overall level of model and texture detail. What makes Halo special really is the way in which the enemies react to your attacks. If you toy around with the grunt AI, for instance, you can really watch this in action. Shooting individual limbs has an impact on the way they react to your shots. Shoot them in the leg and they'll stumble, shoot them in the arm and they might spin around, and after you've taken that first shot, they may panic and run away. Each enemy in the game has its own style of behavior, and the combination of different enemy types combined with the environment allows for some exceptionally enjoyable combat. When you factor in new things like the grappling hook, which not only allows you to move around the environment quickly, but also pull in objects such as these fuel canisters and then immediately throw them at the enemy, it becomes even more enjoyable. Heck, you can even pull weapons directly towards the Master Chief. But let's continue through the mission. I'm glad they stuck with this sort of constrained design for the opening missions of the game. It's very classic Halo. It looks noticeably improved, of course, but it still feels authentic. Conversely, this first mission also reveals one of my nitpicks with the game's visual design, the lighting on dynamic objects. Playing through, in many scenes, you get the impression that the enemies you're fighting against do not fully blend into the environment. Like here, this area is bathed in a red glow, yet the dead grunt is lit by some non-existent white light instead. Or here, where the enemies just sort of stand out or glow compared to the rest of the scenery. Yet at other times, enemies do seem to be influenced by the world lighting, but the contribution seems a little bit off. It's not as strong as you would expect. As best as I can tell, the lighting seems to only impact the specularity of objects. Look again at the grunt here lying on the floor, or the weapon in Chief's hand. The influence of the red light on these objects should be much stronger, so you end up with this sort of mismatch where the lighting only partially influences the object. It looks strange. It could always be intentional just to better highlight enemies in an area, yet at the same time, if you go back to something like, say, Halo 2 Anniversary, you can see the enemies emerging from darkness here at the beginning. They're properly lit by the lights within the scene. They blend more naturally into the environment as a result, rather than sticking out as they do in Infinite. This is certainly going to be a matter of taste, I suspect, but I'd like better integration with the lighting model. Eventually, though, you work your way through the stage, and Chief decides to scuttle the Star Cruiser, leading to an impressive escape sequence that asks the player to platform between falling ships in a large open hangar bay. It's a beautifully executed sequence that's fun to play through. As we finish off this first mission, however, it brings us to another series of cutscenes. If you watched our preview video, you may remember this issue, the rate of the facial animations. Essentially, these update at basically 30 frames per second, which is a mismatch for the game's actual frame rate. This is still a problem in the review build, but there is some hope as 343 has already examined some of the issues we've raised as mentioned earlier. And if you look back at the 2020 version of the game, it does not have the 30 FPS animation update for facial expressions. Based on this, I'm crossing my fingers that this issue is also fixed in a future build. Honestly, the cutscene presentation in general is kind of a strange one to me, at least in this review build. Storytelling plays a huge role in Halo Infinite, and there are a lot of cutscenes in this game. Based on their prior work, I'm actually surprised that some of these issues slipped through. In fact, for comparison's sake, I loaded up Halo 5 and was genuinely stunned at how well lit, directed, and rendered these real-time sequences truly are. This is a game that was designed primarily for the original Xbox One, and I feel like they're generally more visually striking than any of the similar scenes in Halo Infinite. Granted, the technology and the way they're lit is completely different between these two games, it seems, and there's a different focus in Halo Infinite. But it is worth remembering what they've achieved in the past. But okay, that's enough about the introduction stage. Let's touch on the second mission. This one takes players into a beautiful Forerunner structure and reveals some masterful design work in the process. The iconic Forerunner architecture defined by the original Halo Combat Evolved is key to this aesthetic, but its angular shapes run the risk of appearing simplistic in a next-generation game. Thankfully, perhaps more than any of their prior releases, 343 has managed to find the perfect balance. The silhouette of the architecture remains, but in-surface detail is massively increased, lending it a very modern appearance without sacrificing its sleekness. It's honestly one of the most beautiful environments in the entire game. Beyond this, the second mission also leans heavily on exceptionally well done screen space reflections. SSR is of course still common today and essentially relies on reusing information in screen space to generate reflections. Problem is, anything occluded from view will not be reflected as it's no longer in screen space, so it requires a careful hand in implementation, specifically when it comes to the placement of fallback cube maps beneath the SSR. The two align very well in this game. In this case, both the material response to these reflections and the careful design of the environments allows them to shine. It looks phenomenal. Deeper still, there's some brilliant effects work and scene composition in this stage, which really highlights the visual potential of Halo Infinite. But it also highlights the audio, which I feel is a central part of any Halo experience and something I'd like to touch on now, specifically the soundtrack. Marty O'Donnell's iconic score defined the original sound of Halo, and since his departure from the series, 343 has struggled to find the right tone. That's not to say that Halo 4 and 5 don't have excellent soundtracks, they absolutely do, but Halo Infinite feels like a true return to form in a way that completely floored me. This time, 343 has assembled a remarkable trio consisting of Curtis Schweitzer, whose background lies primarily in TV and short film, Joel Korelitz, who contributed to the sound of Death Stranding while composing for games such as The Unfinished Swan and The Tomorrow Children, along with Gareth Coker, who is responsible for the legendarily brilliant Ori soundtracks. The result is the best Halo soundtrack in years. While Marty's original themes run throughout, the bulk of the music carries its own themes and has a huge impact on the overall mood and atmosphere of the game. It ranges from quiet, tension-building tracks such as this,
Dumb question. How do you know this isn't a trap?
I don't.
Great. I hope this weapon of yours is worth the risk. I'm reading multiple enemy ships heading this way. Too many. We're running out.
to the more powerful combat-feeling pieces like this,
Death comes, human.
to others with an almost The Terminator-like electronic percussion sound. Halo Infinite truly impresses with its musical chops, often building that strong emotional connection with the action that serves to enhance the overall gameplay experience. It's really that good. Of course, the actual sound effects work is equally excellent, with a spacious surround sound mix that responds to your surroundings beautifully. The use of Dolby Atmos contributes a lot to the game, though the Xbox still has a slight delay when playing back a Dolby Atmos soundtrack within a game. I still think it's worth using. The point is, Halo Infinite sounds incredible, and audio is one of the game's most powerful presentation tools. This is one area where they absolutely lived up to expectations and even went beyond. But with that said, let's wrap up this section covering the second mission and make our way to the game's most significant change, the open world. This is the point where Halo Infinite begins to deviate most from its predecessors, the moment when the game shifts towards something familiar, yet decidedly new, the open world segments. I mentioned this earlier, but I feel that the design and flow of Zeta Halo was heavily inspired by the second mission of Halo Combat Evolved, simply titled Halo. This mission has the player supporting Marines while exploring a wide-open expanse along the way. While constrained by today's standards, the non-linear design of this mission was a true revelation of the time, and Halo Infinite very much builds on this foundation while greatly increasing the sense of scale in the process. This, however, does come at a cost. There's a lot of aspects I greatly enjoy in Halo Infinite's open world. It genuinely surprised me in that sense. But I do have some visual critiques as well, which we'll be discussing along the way. Firstly though, I mentioned earlier that Halo Infinite does not merely duplicate the, in my opinion, flawed design of many open world games, but what does that look like in practice? Well, primarily this stems from the way in which the world is structured and what your actions mean to each mission. Halo Infinite is built around the concept of a broken Halo ring. Look to the distance and you'll see pieces floating in space, disconnected from one another. As you progress, you explore these pieces and They basically serve as mission zones, again, kind of comparable to the second mission of Halo 1, but at a much larger scale. You always have a main objective, like a classic Halo game, but the width of the mission has been expanded, allowing you to find your own way. The various outposts scattered around the map are optional, but offer tangible rewards such as vehicles once you've taken over. There's never so much content as to feel overwhelming either. You don't feel as if Halo is a giant checklist of tasks, and this is ultimately why I feel it works. But there's more to it than that. Perhaps my favorite aspect of this world lies in the sense of scale and the focus on verticality. The hexagonal pillars slicing through the terrain and steep angles of the cliff sides really help create an environment that you want to explore, and thanks to the grappling hook, you actually can. You can observe the world from above, and it is glorious. It also allows you to observe battles from a distance. The feeling of walking into a conflict already underway is effective, and it also reveals that enemy animations usually play at full rate, even from a distance, unlike Halo 5. This hugely improves the feeling of distant combat compared to Halo 5. It's a nice boost. But if you move up close, the actual quality of the game's assets impress. Weapons, structures, enemies, and other objects all feature loads of granular detail. If you stop and look at things such as the trunk of a tree, the dirt and rocks scattered across the ground, or even the ground cover itself, it's quite impressive. You can walk up and zoom in on any object, and most of them hold up really well. You can feel that a lot of love and time was poured into building these elements to populate the world. There's a real density to the environments as well, but also legibility. It's simple to parse each scene, and it never winds up feeling overly sparse either. The striking contrast between the more natural surfaces and the hexagonal structures visible across the world is genuinely excellent most of the time. I also want to stress just how good the materials can be in this game. The metals in particular look absolutely stunning up close and behave very realistically with light. But even things like the pilot's clothes, which look supremely detailed and highly realistic, which, by the way, look hugely improved in the final game versus the 2020 demo, where they're a little bit flat. Now, in addition to moving to a larger world, Infinite also marks the first time the series has tackled a day-night cycle, and this one is interesting. Watch closely and you'll see the shadows traveling along the ground based on the position of the sun. This has the effect of changing the atmosphere based on the time of day. Infiltrating a base at night feels quite different than taking it head-on midday. But lighting such a world is difficult, and this is where Halo Infinite does fall a little short. In the case of the Slipspace engine, the team has shifted to a fully real-time lighting system with diffuse global illumination handled via a probe system. These probes contain the lighting data which is sampled across the world, allowing the objects to appear indirectly lit. This system enables a real-time update, which is crucial when you have a dynamic time of day, but their approach to lighting the world has some limitations as well. This time-lapse shot should give you a good idea of how the game works in terms of its day-night cycle. It's also worth noting that the day-night cycle in Halo Infinite is exceptionally long for an open-world game like this. We captured a lot of footage to make these clips, and it definitely seemed to last well over 30 minutes, maybe closer to an hour. Before discussing this though, I think it's important to remember that Halo Infinite has basically been in development for upwards of 6 years, and I suspect that many of the decisions made in regarding to the real-time lighting was done while targeting a system like the Xbox One X, at 60 frames per second no less. This is not an easy task. I'd imagine by targeting Xbox Series X, S, and the PC exclusively in the future, we should see it grow and improve. So firstly, it seems that Halo Infinite is using probes for its dynamic diffuse indirect lighting, right? This means that sunlight can bounce off one surface to a nearby surface and pick up the color of the first surface. This works reasonably well in Halo Infinite, though sometimes probe positioning can lead to geometry picking up an unexpected color, like this orange pillar here surrounded by silver and green materials. In general though, it works pretty well, I think. The issue here is that Halo Infinite doesn't really seem to handle indirect specular lighting very well, and is basically lacking indirect shadows entirely. which I believe ties into the reason why Halo looks the way it does in the great outdoors. While exploring indirectly lit areas, for instance, you'll notice a prominent bluish glow. Look closely at the highlights here. But really, the main issue here is the way in which shadows are handled. Currently, Halo Infinite leans primarily on cascaded shadow maps, along with screen space shadows, and that's basically it. So the issue is that there's a lot of huge vistas in this game where you can see miles into the distance. This is very impressive, but the shadow map cascade is relatively aggressive, so as you move away from objects, you'll see shadows disappearing without any sort of fallback. As a result, distant trees and objects basically have no shadows. That's not to say there aren't still large-scale distance shadows, of course. Large chunks of scenery are represented from afar, as you can see in this sequence, but more granular objects are not taken into account at all and appear somewhat unshaded at a distance. We really need large-scale occlusion shadows here. Now, many games tackle this by pre-calculating large-scale ambient occlusion. Check out this example from Hussein's excellent graphics study blog. This shot shows the baked ambient occlusion used in Red Dead Redemption 2. All these areas are indirectly shadowed and can be applied at a large scale. Without this, distant areas would be lacking the extra nuance you get as a result, but that's kind of what we're seeing in Halo if you compare the two, right? But there's other solutions to solving this problem. Unreal Engine, for instance, supports signed distance field shadows that can help with long view distances. An example in their documentation here demonstrates the difference. If implemented, it could greatly improve the overall look of the game at a distance. Speaking of Unreal and SDFs, Kena Bridge of Spirits on the PC allows us to examine the difference in practice. In this image, SDF ambient occlusion is disabled. Note how the background areas appear to glow somewhat. Look familiar? Well, if you enable SDF AO, suddenly the scene is brought to life with rich ambient shadowing filling in the darkened forest. This is exactly the kind of technique that Halo could benefit from for distance rendering and could solve many of its occlusion issues. Even stuff like this, where the area beneath the building is completely lit, when realistically it should be in some sort of shadow as a result of the structure blocking the light. I genuinely believe that if they were to implement much improved occlusion shadows into the game, it would transform the look. I mean, you look at something like Halo 2 Anniversary and the way its walls are handled on Delta Halo. While not calculated in real time, the occlusion shadows add a lot of depth to the scene that's kind of lacking in Halo Infinite. And this is ultimately my main visual nitpick with the open world part of Halo Infinite. It's something I'd like to see improved in time. An even better solution would be a next-gen exclusive ray-traced GI option, a la Metro Exodus I suppose, but who knows if that's even possible right now. Still, despite this, I do think the world is generally attractive thanks to its massive vistas and unique terrain design. It's certainly more inspired than the typical open world environment we see these days, and there are some features designed to improve the overall look that I want to mention now. Volumetric fog, for instance, is used throughout the game, especially as the sun sets, lending the environment some additional depth, for instance. Or how about the cloud simulation? 343 is using a procedural system of some sort that allows for dynamic, constantly changing cloud cover, which looks pretty nice. The rest of the skybox is suitably attractive as well, with a beautiful starry expanse, including ships and the Halo ring itself filling the horizon. In addition, a cloud shadow layer is used across the terrain. This at least helps offset the lack of typical distance shadows, at least during the day, and it breathes additional life into the environment itself. So in terms of the way the environment is represented in this game, I generally feel that the lighting falls short, but the overall scene complexity, quality of the simulation, and the way in which it feeds the gameplay is incredibly well done. And that simulation is a huge part of the Halo experience. Halo Infinite features physics where it counts, I would say. There's this kinetic energy to the way the game feels. Each weapon has a different impact on enemies and objects in a way that feels highly dynamic. The size and scale of the battles and the distances from which you can choose to engage is unique in this day and age. Many games have promised this sort of gameplay experience, but I feel that none of them truly offer the level of freedom you get in a Halo firefight. I can't stress this enough, 343 finally got this right. In fact, this might be the best Halo has ever played. It feels both faithful to the original, but also improved in many ways. The only real caveat to raise regarding interactivity is the foliage. As you'd expect, foliage reacts to the Master Chief, but unlike something like Crisis, where it blends realistically, the foliage in Halo kind of shifts between the two states based on your position, almost like flipping a switch. It's slightly bizarre looking, don't you think? How about the water simulation? This has always been an important aspect of the Halo series. The original game introduced pixel-shaded water effects that looked incredible for 2001, while sequels like Halo 3 greatly increased the immersion by simulating ripples geometrically as the player shoots or moves through bodies of water. Halo Infinite has its own approach. For starters, the surface of the water changes slightly to simulate wind moving across its surface. Look closely and you can see how it changes. In addition, reflectivity varies based on the angle, allowing you to see below the water surface where you should realistically, and the reflections at a distance are now using SSR, unlike most older Halo titles, so it winds up looking pretty good. Okay, so how about the rest of the animation work? Well, as I mentioned earlier, enemies now update at full rate even from a distance, but if the animation itself wasn't of high quality, it wouldn't matter, would it? Thankfully, it is. The movement of enemies is extremely well implemented here. Their feet properly connect with the ground using IK as they move, and they fall like a sack of potatoes when taken down. It's especially great when you toss a grenade into a pack of enemies and watch them explode everywhere. This part of the engagement feels absolutely awesome. Unfortunately, the animation rate issue we mentioned in our preview remains. Certain first-person animations, such as reloading specific weapons like this, or simply climbing a ledge, are updated at half rate or 30 frames per second. You see these animations a lot during gameplay, and I do think they detract from the overall feeling of fluidity. If you're watching this 343, please consider looking into it, as I think it would enhance the already amazing combat loop. These issues did not exist in the 2020 gameplay demo either, so I kind of feel like it should be possible to address, perhaps through something like interpolation. But while we're discussing the first-person representation of Master Chief, the open world also reveals another really curious artifact I wanted to mention. So firstly, here's an interior shot of the game before you emerge into the open world. Look closely at the Chief's hands here. They're solid and nicely detailed, right? Just as you'd expect. Now, let's switch to the open world. Look at his hands again. If you examine them closely, you should notice the vertices warbling slightly, almost like an old Quake 2 engine game. What's going on here? Well, our best guess in this case is that this is an issue potentially due to a lack of floating point precision that occurs specifically when in the open world. Why is that? Well, most games like this use 32-bit single precision floating point numbers for calculations. It's fast and usually precise enough. Problem is, with large open worlds, the further you move from the map's origin point, or 0, 0, 0 in a 3D space, the numbers you're dealing with increase in size. With Float 32, as the numbers grow, you lose decimal digits and numbers become less accurate as a result. This can lead to precision errors in your 3D calculations, which could potentially produce results like this. There are ways to overcome this, of course, and we've seen that in many other games that shipped over the past generation or two. But here's what's really interesting. The series actually has a history of this sort of thing. In this close-up of Master Chief in Halo 5, for instance, you can see the same visible warbling on his suit. The same thing is visible with Halo 2 Anniversary's rocket launcher. But the fact that you only see this in the open world in Halo is kind of what I find most fascinating. It seems to become slightly more or less visible in specific areas, perhaps related to the distance from the point of origin. Either way, if you notice this, that's likely what's going on. Now, as you continue to make your way through the campaign, you'll soon discover how the structure of the game works. After completing the initial set of objectives in the first open area, you'll eventually make your way back indoors. The structures you explore are gorgeous, much like the opening two missions, and often showcase the engine at its absolute best. Halo Infinite features a surprising number of boss battles as well, which sees the player facing off against larger, more difficult foes. But thankfully, this time they got it right. This isn't a Warden Eternal situation like Halo 5, where you fought the same giant boss over and over and over again. There is some actual variety here. Breaking the world up into these multiple chunks allows for improved pacing that matches classic Halo while expanding on the gameplay opportunities. In that sense, Halo Infinite truly embodies the wide linear approach to design that I've come to appreciate. But I think it's also worth looking back on what could have been achieved on a visual level. In 2018, Microsoft opened its E3 press conference with this trailer. It was a magical moment for Halo fans and was meant to serve as a technical demo for the new Slipspace engine that would power Halo Infinite. Natural environments are stunningly lit and shaded, and it's just superbly detailed and evocative throughout. The thing is, what they're showing here feels almost entirely disconnected from the final product. We've seen this sort of thing with early announcement trailers in the past, games like Anthem or Watch Dogs and the like, and I kind of feel like we're seeing it here again, but perhaps in different circumstances. The quality of the rendering on display is higher quality than the final game. Yes, it was listed as a game engine demonstration, and such demos typically push visual features beyond what's realistic in a shipping game. I get that, but still, I think it's a little disappointing. But the following year is perhaps more telling. In 2019, 343 showed a new trailer, which is basically the final game's introduction sequence. This is far more interesting. It feels like the general quality of the rendering is more robust in this preview footage. For starters, the self-shadows and lighting are improved, and the depth of field is of higher quality, plus the pilot's skin exhibits proper subsurface scattering. In addition, the animation feels more natural and less exaggerated. It still very much looks like something that should be possible in real time though, but there's an extra layer of quality here I think that's missing in the final game. Eventually, when the pilot makes his way to the cockpit, we see another key difference. Note how the lighting is applied in the scene. As he runs through the shadow and emerges before the controls, he picks up the light glow of the surrounding more realistically, while the final game exhibits sort of this glowy look. This is exactly the type of lighting that we lamented being absent from the final game, but it's here in this demo. If you look then in this scene, note how the bokeh depth of field blurs both the interior of the object and the edge, more like a real camera, while the final game exhibits a hard line between the two, so that's not quite as good either. As the pilot cheers then, there is a stronger direct shadow in the final game versus the more diffuse shadows in the E3 trailer. However, the 2019 version exhibits richer occlusion shadows. Check out this ammo box here. It looks so nice and detailed in the E3 footage and more connected to the scene. You can see similar occlusion shadows on the Chief's armor as he moves forward through the ship. Again, this is exactly what we wanted to see in the final game. Plus, if you notice, this footage has none of the animation issues. It's a full 60 FPS. While games often change during development, it is odd to me that this engine seems to offer many of the features we wanted to see in the final game, yet those features are not present in the end. There's no way we could possibly guess why these features were scrapped, but both of these trailers looked downright incredible in a way that isn't necessarily translated in the end. Now at this point, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground regarding the technical aspects of the open world, and I hope you can see that despite the issues I've raised, I still generally love what the team has accomplished here. Honestly, it excites me more for the future of Halo games than anything else. Getting to this point was clearly very difficult for the studio, but the potential here is off the charts. In a follow-up game, for instance, I could imagine seeing multiple biomes similar to classic Halo. Infinite only has one biome in addition to the interior sections, and I'd imagine this is likely due to the difficulty in building such a large-scale Halo game. As I mentioned earlier, I'd also like to see what can be done when exclusively targeting a more powerful console like Xbox Series X. So yeah, Halo Infinite is a fascinating game to examine, making this one of the most interesting titles I've looked at all year in a sense. But perhaps now is a good time to move on to our next section, the performance. When 343 took over the Halo series, one of the best moves the studio made was pushing Halo to 60 frames per second. Sure, Halo 4 and Anniversary on Xbox 360 were still targeting 30, but when they made the jump to Xbox One, the team focused exclusively on delivering higher frame rates for more responsive gameplay. I respect that, and with Halo Infinite, that dedication remains, at least on most platforms. As noted earlier, Halo Infinite on Xbox Series X features two modes, a performance mode and a quality mode, offering 120Hz and 60Hz support respectively. We'll have another video soon showcasing how the game runs across all the various Xbox platforms and maybe even a deeper look at Series X performance, but for now I wanted to showcase what you can generally expect from the game. So firstly, the quality mode. This is my preferred mode of play for Halo Infinite, which I'll explain in a moment. But this one targets 60 frames per second. I found that by and large, the game delivers exactly that, the expected level of performance, and most of the gameplay runs at a stable 60 frames per second as a result. It feels every bit as fast and fluid as you'd hope, and with the lack of motion blur, it's actually a perfect showcase of black frame insertion on an OLED display. I highly recommend using that, in fact, if you have the option. That said, as you can see from the graph, it's not 100% locked. There are still some minor dips and skips here and there, but given the scale of the action and the unpredictability of everything, it's not entirely surprising that some dips can still occur. But during most combat sequences, we're pretty much just looking at single frames here and there, so it's not a huge deal. I noted a few extra drops here and there while playing the game normally, but since there's no mission select, I wasn't able to get back to those spots to recapture it for FPS analysis. But why would I recommend this mode over 120Hz when I've constantly preached the good word of super high frame rates? Okay, so firstly, let's take a look at the graph. As you can see, the frame rate does regularly dip below 120 frames per second, especially when engaged in combat. This may seem disappointing, but honestly, again, given the scope and complexity of the game world, aiming for 120 frames per second is kind of a ridiculous goal. Delivering every frame within an 8 millisecond window is really difficult to pull off. The visuals take the expected hit, of course, but unfortunately they weren't able to fully optimize it to reach that objective. Now here's the thing though, normally on Xbox Series X this wouldn't be a big deal. You simply turn on VRR or variable rate refresh and all those dips disappear. This was fully supported by Xbox and on many higher end TVs. It's honestly an amazing feature that can completely solve the issues you get when dipping under a multiple of the refresh rate. Unfortunately, in Halo Infinite, it doesn't work. Yes, the TV displays the correct number, but the fluidity isn't there. It feels just as juddery as it would without VRR. Most other Xbox games utilize this feature just fine, so it's a little disappointing to see it here. That makes for another feature that I think 343 should absolutely look into addressing, as without VRR, the 120Hz mode never really feels entirely smooth. So yeah, given the choice, I would definitely recommend going with the 60Hz mode. It looks better and it runs very consistently overall, I'd say. Another performance related issue I did encounter though is this. Yeah, several times during my gameplay experience, the game would just kind of seize up like this, as if it had crashed before coming back to life. It's a little bizarre, I'll say that much. Also, after playing for a while, I started noticing things like this, where the textures would basically load and unload when simply turning the camera. Perhaps there's a memory leak or something here responsible for these two issues. Difficult to say, but it seems like something that should be fixable in a patch, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. One area where the game does perform well on Xbox Series X though is loading times. There are loading screens between interior and exterior areas, but thankfully, they're very quick on Series X. I'll be curious to see how the last gen machines using mechanical hard drives stack up in this regard though. I'd also like to take a moment to commend 343 for its exhaustive options menu. There's so many adjustments here that can be made to fine-tune the experience, from controls, including support for mouse and keyboard if you like, to visual features, sound, the UI, and accessibility. It's absolutely packed. And honestly, that could be said for the game as a whole. Despite some of the issues I've mentioned in this video, Halo Infinite is a remarkable release. Against the odds, I feel that 343 has delivered one of the best first-person shooters of the last decade. It's a game that far exceeds the previous work on Halo 4 and 5, in terms of design at least, and nailing the combat sandbox. Hopefully, even with my critiques, my love of Halo Infinite still manages to shine through. It's not perfect, clearly, but given the seemingly difficult development, I'm pretty happy with what 343 has delivered here. Halo Infinite is superb. I'm also curious to see where the team can go with the Slipspace engine from here. Based on that 2018 trailer and the scale of the final game, there does seem to be a lot of potential here waiting to be unleashed. Having survived this seemingly challenging project, I'm very eager to see where they go next. So yeah, that's my final take on the situation. I really like Halo Infinite, but do have some disappointment with certain visual choices the team made. Whether you subscribe to Game Pass or just pick up the game on its own, I think it's absolutely worth checking out. But I suppose that's going to do it for this longer than usual video. There was a lot to discuss in regards to the game's technical makeup, and hopefully I've covered just about everything here. But of course the rest of the DF team has Halo Infinite videos in the works covering the rest of this release, including the PC version and of course the other consoles. They may or may not be available right now, depending on when you're watching this video. But if you did enjoy this video, be sure to let us know. Like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, all that good stuff. And if you want to see this video in its original high quality format, go over to digitalfoundry.net and check out the Digital Foundry supporter program. But that's enough for me, so thanks for watching.